trigger. Thank you.
I'm speaking to you from Perth, from Noongar country, also from lockdown country and bushfire country at the moment. I've got about 30 minutes here to address these issues. I have slides which I'll run through. There is some detail on the slides. I assume the slides will become available. So the headings of the slides may be the main point that you get through this presentation. These are the three issues I hope to address, or parts of them. The first is the question of lawyers' briefs to anthropologists for compensation research. And in fact, prior to Justice Mortimer's comments yesterday, I had the note in there about ensuring realistic expectations, question mark. The question of reports being needed has been raised by her. There's the matter of fieldwork and the previous results of research, and of course the breadth of research issues that are going to arise in compensation. The middle points there are about just an indication of the concepts. I think this is a complex area for research, for anthropological research, and for research that might be undertaken by other social scientists of one kind or another. We've got the definition of compensable acts. We've got the concept of loss. The question that always arises is to the right people. The big one about the effects of compensable acts on connection, and then collateral detrimental effects as the term was used in Timber Creek. And down the bottom, a very important point that I think risks being lost, because, the history of native title and land rights is that the test cases have been done in the north, if you like, or the more traditional settings. And yet we know that to research compensation in different parts of the continent is going to mean different things. Now, Stephen Wright prepared some training draft materials, which he's happy for me to refer to. Stephen's a barrister based in Perth, and he prepared that, as some of you will know, for the National Native Title Council's discussions a while ago. I refer to Stephen's work simply because here, Stephen's draft brief for anthropologists runs to 4 pages, and then 5 pages of draft questions for claimant witnesses. If we were to, as an anthropologist, take on a brief of that kind, we're looking at a minimum of 6 months full-time research to prepare a report, and I would suggest probably much longer. It's very detailed and very comprehensive, as you'd expect from an experienced barrister in the native title area. I won't talk for long about the details in Stephen's materials, but he addresses overall issues that need to be looked at, questions of connection from 1975 onwards, the effects of acts on the exercise of native title rights and on the connection to country, and potentially on individuals as well as collectivities if that distinction arises. He's directing us as anthropologists to look at cumulative effects over time, the big issue about whether our opinions in preparing work are the same as or differ from previous determination findings. A very difficult matter, I've been saying for some time, I think, is for an anthropologist to make predictions about the effects of acts on future generations, though that does seem to arise out of Timber Creek and certainly in Stephen's suggestions. And then the effects of these compensable acts compared with other things, other developments, including what might have occurred pre-1975. It's a big picture. And likewise, his specific questions for claimant witnesses who, in terms of anthropological research, I should say, are research participants. They're not really claimant witnesses. And I do think that anthropology needs to be clear about the language of its discipline and not be completely swamped by the legal concepts and the legal terminologies, but we can return to that. He suggests anthropologists may ask claimants about access to country, ceremonies, changes to topography and water, environmental impacts, whatever obligations they feel they've got, including to future generations, possibly distinctions between the interests of men and women. And usefully, the bottom final point there, any positive effects of acts that are mixed with negatively experienced impacts. That is another big issue that the researcher will face, in my opinion. Down the bottom, I won't take us to the legal principles that he addresses. Now, I think a simpler way of perhaps listing this, the research task, you can see I've put at the top there the word potentially in square brackets. That's a bit of an aside, but from the point of view of the research anthropologist, these acts are potentially compensable, it seems to me. They're not compensable at face value, as the terminology is going to be used by lawyer advocates for claimant parties. And it's a small point, but I think short of inserting the word potentially every time a report refers to compensable acts, we may need a footnote early on to explain our approach. And the three issues there arise out of Timber Creek. The High Court decision is very interesting reading, I think. We have identified acts, we have identified holders of connection by laws and customs. However, I will go on to talk about that being an issue for research. And we have the consideration of the effects of the compensable acts, and that's where we get to the concept of cultural loss. And thinking about yesterday's presentation from Justice Mortimer, of course, there will be pressure, there is pressure to narrow the issues, so to speak. And well, I think for compensation research, it's absolutely critical that anthropologists come into discussion with legal representatives prior to the finalising of briefs. Well, cultural loss is all about country and it's about tradition. And when you read through the paragraphs in Timber Creek, it's pretty clear. You see that what it tells us is that the loss is something in the relationship of people to country. It's inherent in the thing that's been lost, to use the wording of the court. Importantly, the effects can't be divorced from the content of laws and customs, which helps us distinguish in principle other forms of loss. Here, it's not just about subjective feelings, hurt feelings, although difficult when those feelings will be arising very substantively in research. And as the court recognised, the strength of feeling may have evidentiary value. Well, I would say here that in the research exercise, it's likely to be those feelings that constitute a very substantial portion of the data that support the expert opinion. Down the bottom in Timber Creek, the point comes that the hurt at particular locations can affect customary activities nearby. It's not defined how far. This is this issue of collateral detrimental effects. For example, I think in Timber Creek, there was a ritual ground next to a road. The road was the compensable act, I think, yet the researchers pointed to impacts on the ritual ground and hence the question of cultural loss. And I do want to say that, and as well as that, the loss can be experienced across a continuum of persons connected to the location of the compensable acts, which leads us to a substantive issue for research, which is the politics of expectations on the ground among those with whom we're doing research. Expectations including who should appropriately receive any compensation. Practical issues, obviously, how much fieldwork, how long, how much funds available, availability of consultants and in-house anthropologists, and most importantly, how extensive is the available anthropological and related documentation. I've found in one compensation report that I've prepared that the availability of GIS material has been important to summarise the historical sequence of modifications to landscapes at the locations of compensable acts. And I make the point there that we can't assume, though some lawyers may, that people are going to remember over the last 45 years the nature of these acts. And we can't also assume that the evidence of the acts will necessarily be visible, and a buried pipeline is a good example of that. 35 years ago, how many people remember the nature of that act? Obviously, the existing familiarity of the researcher is critical, as in all native title research. I'd suggest not essential, but advantageous. And, you know, how many consultants are required, and that takes us to the geographical extent of the effects of the compensable acts. So if it's across a region where there's more than one claim group, more than one determination, what kinds of collaboration and exchange of findings operate between more than one consultant? That does touch on Justice Mortimer's comments about conferrals of experts and when those happen as well. Available materials, I won't go in detail to this, but it is very critical, especially with this idea that we don't want the research for compensation to reinvent the wheel. So we need to clarify what's going to be available as regards previous research. And that includes not just native title reportage, but heritage reports, for example, I think in many jurisdictions are going to be important. And we know that in states and territories, the regime for the holding of heritage reports can be different from the holding of native title and other land rights reports. I want to draw our attention down here to the fact that the anthropologists may well encounter disagreements among native title holders as to the results of previous research. So we can't assume, though it would be best if it was the case, that the results of the previous research, which is then available to allow narrowing of issues for compensation research, that all of that will be uncontested. And that is the legal view here, that it's the native title holders in law who are the ones claiming compensation. However, local views may or may not want to raise other issues about broader deserving groups. And there are a whole lot of bases that anthropologists will know as to the possible broader definition of those groups who want to seek compensation. Which takes us to local politics. And since the determination, of course, the views about who the right people are may have changed. We've got the operation subsequently of the PBC, membership, money, agreements, local politics. We've got possible views that some people have been left out or wrongly included. We've got local views potentially that some people have already been favoured in beneficial agreements, informal or otherwise, with the proponent or the builder or the developer of these compensable acts, a big mine, for example. So part of the research task we have to foreshadow, though hopefully it doesn't come to dominate the process, is to unravel contests over foreshadowed compensation as to what's based in law and custom and what's driven by other aspirations for financial, economic advancement. And this is of course, the way native title in general can entail traditional connections being skewed by a whole range of factors and local level politics. We do know, though, that native title research also needs to address change, and there are legitimate modes of adaptation according to law and custom, and that's also so change happens, and change may well happen after a determination has occurred, so we need to be paying attention to that. I won't dwell here, but intergenerational issues about the effects of compensable acts is a difficult one. And I do feel there's too much of an assumption among legal colleagues at the moment that anthropologists can make predictions about what the effects are going to be on future generations. How would we do that? Well, we'd have to document information from elders and parents and youth. We will have what young people say as well as everybody else. We'll have a whole lot of issues about intergenerational relationships. We may have something that's already in the discussion about native title, about the risks of enforced traditionalism when young people may frame their relationship to country and the effects of compensable acts in somewhat different ways. Can we have a toolkit? Well, that'd be nice. We've got the kind of thing that Stephen Wright's prepared, which is of great value for us. I've just generated some general questions there about how the conversation with native title holders and others can go, in my experience. Thinking about that road that was built, what happened to the country, what had happened to the country before, what's there in the country now, keeping in mind that the focus of anthropological research will, of course, be very much on the question of spiritual relationships to country. What do you feel about what's happened to the country? Do others feel the same way? And has it been good or bad or okay, what's happened to the country? So the inquiry is not assuming, as I said earlier, that the anthropologist knows that everything that's happened in the country connected with these acts has been bad. We're doing an independent inquiry to ask that question. And I think we transparently make clear that our questioning has been along those lines and that will strengthen the authority of the experts' report or opinions. And down the bottom there, well, I'm sure everybody in the room is already across the fact that there are certain sentiments and feelings which are likely to arise in compensation. We saw the first one, the idea of somatic discomfort, arise in Timber Creek with Kingsley Palmer and Wendy Ash's translation or use of the concept of a gut-wrenching feeling of being no good. Feeling sorry for country and feeling shame, which is a very complex emotion in the anthropological and linguistic literature and is worthy of attention for anthropologists addressing compensation. This politics of expectations definitely can't be ignored. So given that it's likely to be money and or land, which is posited as possible compensation, though there may be other things, and my experience is that the topic can quickly become germane to investigative discussions. In Timber Creek, at paragraph 156, the point's made that the award was to be made to the group in globo, and then the apportionment or distribution of compensation being an intramural matter. But that's a comfortable legal ethical nicety that doesn't help the anthropologist whose inquiries are shot through often with all kinds of conversation about who are the right people to be talking about the effects of these compensable acts, and by implication, who are the people who've been affected, and who are the people appropriately, according to law and custom, to receive compensation. Raising this point as an anthropologist complicates things for lawyers, I know that, and possibly for the court. But I'm reminded, listening to Justice Mortimer yesterday, that while we can appreciate the desire to not complicate things and to streamline and narrow issues, anthropologists working on this stuff, I don't want to put it overly bluntly, but we can't give in to that view without making the point that on the ground, things are in fact very complicated, and we note and document and record those complications, and then we come to opinions and conclusions which will be robust, even though we document levels of disagreement and so on. Local versus regional connections, I think, emerge very significantly on this question about expectations as to the social and geographic dimensions of compensation. This slide takes us to the same point, and I won't go through it. It points to some literature which is relevant for those of us doing compensation research on this politically charged issue of different kinds of rights in country, different kinds of connection, and possibly different forms of effect of compensable acts. Of course, change is in a dialectical relationship with loss. Other people have made this point in writing about cultural loss, I'm aware already. And I suppose I wanted to just point to the fact that in Timber Creek, the change was there, but it was way less than what we're going to have in many other cases. So, you know, in Timber Creek, you had findings that the same rituals and ceremonies practiced more than a century ago were still an active part of law and custom. The High Court recognised that at paragraph 217, where the land has been developed much more than in a case like Timber Creek, the sense of connection may have declined before the act of compensable diminishment. And then also in Timber Creek, the issues raised that some developments, as I said earlier, might be considered as acceptable under law and custom. There are slippery notions here requiring careful investigation about the relationship between change and loss. And moving towards a few concluding comments, this issue about different kinds of settings across the continent, very important. You know, in most compensation claims, the question of law grounds and ceremonies may not be relevant at all. I mean, admittedly, that remains to be seen, but I will make that suggestion. The level of detail as to kinds of connection won't be the same as in Timber Creek or in other like areas where, you know, you've got estate groups and different forms of connection through patrifilial, matrifilial relationships and ritual roles and so on. We may have, you know, generally designated tribes, nations, or regions. And as I said, different degrees of cultural loss, and that'll be complicated as well for the researcher, I think, by the efforts at recuperation of connection that we know are going on in many regions. And then the loss prior to 1975 and distinguishing that from compensable acts may be more difficult in the South, for want of a better terminology. So returning to practicalities, look, my points are, one, it's just so important to get the brief right, and I think we're not there yet. I think there's a tension between the kind of comprehensive legal view that we see from Stephen Wright, designed to ensure that the breadth of issues relevant to his clients when they are claimants are addressed. And the compensation, it seems to me, Timber Creek and related, and probably the Native Title Act, allows, as we see in Stephen's work, a broad range of matters, quite extensive for anthropologists. So there's a tension between ensuring sufficient attention comprehensively to the research tasks on the one hand, and the kinds of things Justice Mortimer was speaking about yesterday, with the desire to narrow issues and restrict costs and restrict time involved. So for the anthropologists going into this is all very well, but we have to be very clear what is being asked of us. If we're going to do a narrowed version of the research, then we don't want a brief that's actually asked us to do the comprehensive version. Now, point C, admittedly, we have these relevant documents from the past, and I appreciate that that's what's in the mind of the kind of comments of Justice Mortimer yesterday. So yes, the previous work that's been done must be used, and that is a challenge for anthropologists. We don't want to be going in thinking that we need to do it all from the beginning again, but the nature of the available documentation will vary. Point D does raise the possibility of teamwork among anthropologists, authorship and regional claims. And lastly, there are some issues that might best be left separate from core compensation research. I'm open on this. I'm aware of different ways of thinking. So the different forms of compensation, money or land or both or other things, is a possible matter for a researcher to investigate, as is the future distribution of compensation and canvassing existing corporations that people on the ground may well talk about, as is the right to trade. All of those things can be included in what the researcher is asked to do, but they expand the task, they make it longer and they make it more costly.